We have some breaking news on this Thursday evening out of the Brian Kohberger case in Idaho. A Latah County judge has extended the gag order in the case of the 4 murdered University of Idaho students. This new gag order goes even further than the one initially issued after Kohberger's arrest. We're going to be joined now by legal analyst Nicole DeBoard. Begin, Nicole, by telling us, what does this dissemination order really speak to the case, and what does it do?
What it does is it prevents interested parties in the case from sharing information other than what's in the public record. So in other words, anyone, including reporters or the parties, can talk about what is in the public record or quote it, but what they cannot do is elaborate on it or explain it or give details that are not a part of the public record already.
And we've seen there was an order already in place that said they couldn't really talk to them. What did that initial one does, and maybe what does this one entail, and maybe why would a judge do this at this point in this case, in this trial?
So typically, and judges do this very hesitantly, but if there is a gag order issued, it typically only covers the actual parties in the case. So for example, the prosecutor, law enforcement, the defense team, they would be under the court's order. But when you have an additional team of lawyers, as we do here, the court found it necessary a couple of weeks later to go ahead and loop those lawyers and those legal teams in for the families, the victims' families, those lawyers into the gag order protection, so that ultimately when this case is tried in criminal court, all of the facts will be presented to the jury for the first time in a courtroom, as opposed to something that they've heard from the public.
And it feels like this one is maybe a little bit vague because they don't want a ton of information out there. What kind of communication is prohibited under this new gag order?
Really, any information that any of the knowledgeable parties get about this case really cannot be shared. It is just completely locked in a box until ultimately this case is tried. The exception to that rule is if there is a hearing or if there is a public filing, like a motion or a transcript that is not sealed, people who are involved in the case are going to be allowed to quote from that record. What they can't do, however, is talk about things that they learned in the investigation or things that they suspect or things that they're gathering from their work as they develop their own prosecution strategy or defense strategy.
And definitely in this case, obviously, Latah County, the judge there has issued this, but we've seen different search warrants in Washington, in Pennsylvania for the arrest of Brian Kohberger. How does that work across state lines in that regard?
That's a great question. And you have so many jurisdictions involved in this case because ultimately going to capture this defendant, law enforcement had to cross state lines and involve other departments and jurisdictions. However, the gag order still applies to everyone. It applies to everyone who has information that is not already in the public record. So we are allowed to see what we have seen, which is the public hearing. We have the right to know those details. And we have the right to see what is in a public filing, like the probable cause affidavits, if they are not sealed. And the court can't prohibit people from quoting what is already out there, but the court can prohibit parties from saying anything beyond what is in that public record.
That is so very interesting, just about the information that potentially not could come out until June because we might not get any information about this. How rare is it, though, for a judge to maybe change the circumstances of a thing like a gag order?
It is somewhat rare. I mean, this is such a serious consideration for judges. They want to balance the public's right to know and right to free speech with the extremely important right for those who are accused in any case, and this one is especially serious, to have their constitutional rights protected, which means that all of the information a jury will ultimately consider needs to be brought into evidence through the proper channels in a court of law. And so the judge has to balance those considerations in making a decision like gagging the parties to a case.
And I do have to ask this question because my colleague Andrew Kraft asked this the last time we saw a gag order being put in place. Does it just obtain to the lawyers, but if a media entity does get information, are they held liable to this gag order? How does that work?
They are potentially liable to the gag order. And, it's such a delicate situation because, as we all know, media can have anonymous sources and media goes to great length to protect those sources. But when there's a strict gag order in place and information gets leaked out, you can bet a judge who has issued an order that should not happen will do everything that the judge legally can to get to the bottom of it. And sometimes you can see court battles where even members of the press are potentially having to call their own lawyers to deal with the disclosure of information that is part of a gag order.
That would put another twist on this case if that potentially happens. You mentioned that it is potentially rare that a gag order gets put in place or stricter way that it has now. It's unlikely that it moves back, that there is a release of this gag order until June, correct?
I think that's right. This judge has put this in place to protect what happens in the courtroom on that jury trial day. And we will all get a front row seat because we will be entitled to hear about it in a public courtroom. But until then, we're going to be stuck with only the information that's in those public filings or in a hearing.
That is fair. Nicole DeBoard, legal analyst, thank you so much for joining us. Are there any parting words you want to leave with our audience here on Live Now?
I think this will be an interesting case. We'll still get to hear about it. We're just going to have to wait to hear about it from the public filings and the hearings.
Of course. Thank you so much for joining us. And I know everyone will be tuning in come June when the trial officially begins. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.